So after a few weeks of being in the content mine searching for nothing but Red Hood adaptations and then being forced to watch the entirety of Titans just to have one extra thing to talk about, I decided to flush my brain out by, watching something with actual quality to it. Because let's be honest, we all need a change of pace every now and again. But while I work to getting out of this phase of only watching things that are adaptations of something else, I think I'm going to stay in my comfort zone a little bit longer and look at more examples of this concept in practice. It was either that or re-listen to the Incredibles NSA files for the upteenth time. And because Peacemaker and Alien Earth are both still ongoing and your boy does not like cliffhangers, I had to continue my search to find something that both scratches that itch of a good adaptation, with a lot of energy, and maybe even throwing in some video game aesthetics. The obvious story I was indulging was clear, and the movie was The Electric State.
No.
But since I don't hate myself or feel like rewatching Ready Player One, I'd figure I'd go with one I actually like, so the next best choice was the 2010 Bryan O'Malley adaptation of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, directed by Edgar Wright. A film that I always remember loving, but also kinda confused me. Because if I recall, it's a film that actually didn't have a very strong theatrical release, but to this day is still regarded as something of a classic, especially amongst its cult following. Unfortunately, a 2-hour film is simply just not enough time to fill the dreaded silence between this week's discussion and the last. I need a bit more noise to help keep those darker thoughts brewing within myself and what I assume is everyone else at bay. Luckily, if we fast forward to the year of our Lord 2023, I get to prolong my stay in the Bryan O'Malley verse for just a bit longer, with the Netflix adaptation of what's kind of the same story, or at least at the time that's what was advertised to me as, Scott Pilgrim takes off. But the funny thing is, rather than retelling the same story from the movie, the show in truth carves out its own identity, telling a brand new tale without disregarding or disrespecting the thing that it's based upon. And this is something a lot of adaptations I've noticed try and fail to achieve. But yet this series manages to do so with style, flair, and confidence. And that's something I think is worth looking into. So let's do just that, and let's discuss. Okay, truth be told, when I first found out about this series, and was told it was going to be the same thing as the movie, just with an animated style and aesthetic, my initial reaction was something like groaning in exhaustion, asking, why did they bring everyone back just to tell the same story over again? Like, pretty much every cast member from the live-action adaptation came back to reprise their role for this animated retelling. But my then roommate at the time decided, let's just give it a shot and see what happens. And fearing the worst, I pushed on to the end of the first episode, and watched a pretty much one-to-one recreation of the original film, with a few minor deviations here and there, until it happened. That first fight, Scott versus Matthew Patel, or as you might know him, Evil X number 1.
And I'm Ramona's first evil ex-boyfriend.
I sat back prepared to watch what I hope would be a fun and predictable action scene, only to be taken aback after seeing Scott get reduced to a bus fare in less than 5 seconds. It was here, watching Matthew Patel of all people get crowned the victor. I was hooked. For any of you not familiar with the lore, and spoiler alert I guess for those confused members walking into this video, normally the story goes, Scott beats up every one of these evil exes, one after another, until he faces the most dangerous one in a Tournament of Power style coming of age story. And along his journey he learns lessons like the true meaning of love, self-respect, and discovering what's worth really fighting for. It can be a bit style over substance, but what is there is really compelling and it's all wrapped in this fun art style that is easy to fall in love with. So you can imagine that killing Scott at the end of the first episode is a bit of a divergence to say the least. But with the main character killed off, who are we going to be following for the remaining 7 episodes? Well, instead this go around, we now follow Ramona Flowers as she and everyone else comes to terms with the passing of their beloved, or semi-beloved, or at least kinda like friend Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott.
The other Scott.
No, you wouldn't have heard of me.
However, circumstances result in her not being completely convinced that he has departed this mortal world. And over the course of this investigation, we learn more about the characters, and in particular, Ramona's evil exes, and take a look into why every one of them acts the way they do in the movie and the comic book this is all based on. If what I described to you sounds like a complete departure from the original story, then you would be right about that. Here's an extra life token. Don't spend it all in one place. But hey, now that you can afford to be a little bit more reckless, why not try and do something that takes a bit of real courage, leaving a like, comment, and maybe even subscribing. And speaking of things that take a bit of courage to attempt to pull off, deviating this much from the original source material can be quite a gamble. But I think this adaptation does a great job at balancing both its new story and paying respect to what came before. And I'm not alone in this line of thinking because critics and fans both fell in love with this series. But why is that? Well, let's not pretend that Scott Pilgrim the graphic novel is scripture or anything. It, like all fiction, is imperfect and has plenty of room for improvement. That being said, there is a reason I feel a lot of people fell in love with this story, flaws and all. Mainly down to the endearing characters and the relatable situation of being infatuated with a new person to enter your life, and wanting to do anything and everything to impress them. Even if that means making yourself look like a damn fool in front of all your friends. I know I've been there. It hit plenty of members in the audience at the right time, and the film succeeded in many of the same ways as the graphic novel itself. And the series tasked itself with a similar goal in mind. While an adaptation shouldn't treat its source material like gospel, it should be held in the same regard as a captain holds their map. A guiding force behind your ship with the source text as your North Star. Helping you plot a course, but not necessarily determining every step you take along your journey. And you wouldn't want it to be anyways. If all an adaptation was a one-to-one recreation, then what would the people involved even be needed for? You might as well just get a robot to do it at that point. And not like one of those fun ones in the movies where they have feelings and stuff, but like those soulless creations that billionaires want to use to steal all the fun jobs. And because we can't have anything, the boring ones too. Isn't it great living in the future? No, for an adaptation to work, you need to put some intelligent thought and creativity to guide your story and characters. In Scott Pilgrim's case, the series adds to the original work while remaining in line with what we saw in the initial text. The adaptation further explores the characters and plot points that were only glossed over and never gone into any more detail. And all that it brings to the table is never at odds with what came before. So much so that I personally have no trouble slotting this in with the original graphic novel. This is truly demonstrated in the increased screen presence of all 7 evil X's, who have completely been transformed from disposable bad guys to well-rounded 3-dimensional characters. Or 5 well-rounded characters and a pair of 2-dimensional neutral guys. Yeah, Kyle and Ken still kind of get the short end of the stick. Sorry, fellas. I like the robot, though. Characters like Matthew Patel, who existed just to introduce the conflict and to be killed off before the end of the first act, now have been given a huge upgrade, getting to take over the company from Gideon, and knocking that Silicon Valley rich-looking prick down a peg. Patel gets to run G-Man Media and reshape it in his own quirked-up, wacky image. And actors who have grown so much more since this initial film even come back to lend their likeness and personality to their characters, like in the case of Chris Evans, who gets to shine once again as Lucas Lee. Once a roguish, smooth-talking skater punk, is now an overly confident but deeply insecure young man trying to find a place where he can excel. Initially coming across as a carefree, do-whatever kind of guy, he's actually revealed to be a committed actor, staying in his trailer and learning his lines. They give him a level of depth that you wouldn't expect if you were just going off of the original text. In addition, Brandon Routh's Todd Ingram gets a chance to show a more sensitive side to him, revealing that his relationship with Envy Adams, Scott Pilgrim's Big X, is not from a place of love and compassion, but instead merely out of convenience. And when he develops an attraction to Scott's roommate Wallace, you get to see him go through all the stages of blossoming romance, only to be shunned and sent packing once the film they're working on together wraps. It's a hilarious reversal of one of the X's, also allowing us to get more screen time with Wallace Wells, which is always a plus. Even Roxy Richards is given a greater depiction beyond just being a clever wordplay on the term bi-curious.
I'm a little bi-curious!
Ha-ha!
Giving her resolution to what was a major blow to her self-esteem, inflicted by Ramona herself, who she feels just used and discarded her at the first feeling of discomfort. Also, she benefits from the fact that mainstream media is much better at writing queer characters than they were in the early to mid-2000s. Even the abusive dirtbag Gideon, or Gordon Goose as he's actually known, gets time to show his own insecurities and depressing past which molded him into that cocky son of a bitch he turned out to be in another life. Hell, even the other characters like Scott's bandmates Steven Still, Kim Pine, and young Neil get more to do than just exist to support Scott in his romantic endeavors. His relationship with Knives is explored and, more importantly, dealt with in the most reasonable way you can do in the case of a 23-year-old flirting with a 17-year-old. Yeesh. And it's when watching the show, I see a reverence for these characters, allowing so many of them to get a chance to shine. And this isn't just because of the nature of a television series being longer than a film. The increased screen time certainly helps, but it's the fact that the narrative itself is more interested in investigating who these people are that allows for this deeper exploration to be conducted. And all this wrapped in a beautiful arcade-esque art style really justifies this story as one deserving to be told. And when I say deserves to be told, I mean in the sense of being an adaptation from one medium to another. It comes to the territory that you need to answer the question, for what reason are you retelling this story just in a different medium? Especially when it's already been done successfully before. Because the story lends itself to this episodic format that it has to offer, 8 episodes, each diving into a different group of characters, as it all follows Ramona at the center point of the story, attempting to uncover the mystery as to what happened to Scott, is certainly a unique approach. And even after she does uncover the mystery of where Scott went, and how he time traveled to the present, or I guess his future's past, to prevent himself from ever meeting Ramona, even then, the show uses this to now interrogate the character of Scott. All done in a way that doesn't denigrate or punish fans from enjoying the original work, but instead asks them to be a little bit more critical and figure out what they really liked about that initial story. By having future Scott have come to the conclusion that he would rather have never loved at all rather than loved and lost, forces us to rethink the lessons that he initially learned, and how maybe they haven't been truly cemented within him, and he still needed to do a bit more growing. And this series offers him the chance to do that, as well as better understand the people in his life that he once viewed as adversaries or even enemies. Your mileage may vary, but I found it to be incredibly respectful for the original text, with a mission statement starting with these characters aren't the problem. They have problems. And now you get to see how things would go differently, how they would have addressed these new situations. How even when Scott's out of the picture entirely, everyone in this town is still gunning to kill each other. These are just a few reasons I found this adaptation to be so good, despite being leaps and bounds different from what came before. In a way, it's more or less a sequel to the original source material. But there is just about enough here for me to say it is both an adaptation, as we do play around with the initial narrative, while leaving some parts completely intact. It also helps that the original author, Bryan O'Malley, is so heavily attached to this series, allowing them to have direct creative input on where the story goes, which you would think would mean that it's automatically impossible for this story to be disrespectful for that original text, you know, considering the fact that he wrote it. But you'd be surprised, authors can dishonor their work, and have done so many times before. I mean, hell, have any of you guys seen those special editions to the Star Wars series? Actually, it's best we don't dive into that right now, especially considering the fact that neither I nor the actor himself gives a shit who shot first.
So the answer is Greedo.
But having the original creative team on board for this story certainly helps lend it an extra level of authenticity that it wouldn't have otherwise had. And they've really managed to capture that punk rock and roll feel that the story of Scott Pilgrim lends itself to, with great music, an as stated incredible art design, memorable sound effects, and a returning cast that effortlessly slide back into these roles that they haven't played in over a decade. Throw in a few fun cameos and a reference to the original director, and you really do have something special here. So in the end, Scott Pilgrim takes off, while not particularly being a faithful adaptation, clearly demonstrates a deep reverence for the source material. The original graphic novels were never about perfection, they were about messy people figuring themselves out, and the series takes that same spirit and applies it to the Pilgrimverse itself, letting the story grow up a little bit, questioning itself, and exploring corners that were left in the margins by the original movie. By taking risks instead of hiding behind the panels of a remake, Scott Pilgrim takes off, shows that a good adaptation doesn't have to prove its worth by being identical to what came before, it just has to be honest, creative, and unafraid to level up. And best of all, it told its story in one start to end go, rather than making us wait 5 years for another season, where all interest in the story they were building up to completely dies over the wait. I mean, be honest, do any of you really remember what Stranger Things is about?